We will hear argument this morning in case 2512.
Grievances we could go into with this system. I think we could be here for hours.
National Collegiate Athletic Association.
I think we have some proof, even a few years into NIL now, that people care about the logo.
There are too many people in power who have no desire to give up that power.
The NCAA's ever-shifting decisions, not stable decisions.
Does the concept of amateurism in college athletics even matter anymore?
They've capped it again without any sort of collective bargaining.
We'll finish with our unilateral decision. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Unilateral Decisions. Today we're talking about something that I thought was clear-cut and made sense to me, and now I've got no clue. It's come back up for Alabama's basketball coach talking in a viral clip after a post-game interview, but we're talking NCAA eligibility. What even is NCAA eligibility these days?
Big question. But to kind of go back on why this is resurfacing and why around the NCAA tournament this matters, you know, Nate Oats at Alabama came on after their loss and basically said, well, we wouldn't have been in this position if we had Charles Bediako. And it's like, right, the guy that played professional basketball that you thought was going to be on your roster. How does that even become a conversation? Like, how did we get here? How did we get here in the last 6 months that one of the lightning rod talking points after an NCAA tournament game was we would have been in a lot better position if that pro was on our team? Like, what?
I think a lot of it is just kind of what led to this whole conversation in the first place, which is just a lot of inconsistency. Because, you know, when, you know, Coach Oats was talking about this, he also referred to James Nandi, who got to play at Baylor and didn't take a lawsuit like it took with Bediako. It didn't take anything else. It took, you know, just filing for an NCAA waiver. And, you know, Nandi was in a similar situation. I don't think he had played in the G League, but he had signed a contract with the G League. And he'd gone through the draft. He did all these things. And the NCAA said that's totally fine. And you also have a ton of, you know, professionals, and call them what they are. There are professionals playing in Europe who are able to come over and play college sports now. I mean, really a lot of these things are flipped, and I think Coach Oats is very justified in a lot of ways in saying, why is the situation different? Where is the line? And I think that's what a lot of people are wondering. Like, is the line actually like you play games in the G Leagues, you play games professionally? Because it's not where the line used to be, that's for sure.
That kind of goes back to one of the things we talked about, you know, a few episodes ago. I brought up the USGA being able to establish their own rules, and their rules of amateurism trump, you know, the NCAA rules that are in place. And I asked you the question if it would be possible for each professional organization to establish their own rules of amateurism, and that could potentially allow the NCAA to just be the entity where amateurism, amateur competition is what exists. But I think we've had a lot of conversations about how we kind of got to this point, but we haven't gotten to have the conversation about why this isn't simpler. You know, I bring up the golf example because the NBA could establish its own amateurism rules. I don't know that it behooves them to say, yeah, we're going to fix this for the NCAA in basketball, but the NCAA is an organization. The rules are set, you know, by the membership, and we all agree that these are the rules. To become a lawyer, you don't just go to school. You have to pass the bar. Like, the governing body, this is what it means to be a lawyer. Like, my wife is an occupational therapist. She has to pass a test to be able to practice. They establish what the rules are. Why isn't it as simple for the NCAA to say, these are the rules? If you want to be a D1 institution, these are the rules you have to abide by, and everybody that you sign is abiding by the same rules. Like, why isn't it that simple?
And the answer is, and it's a great question. It's a really, really good question. I get this question very, very often. I see this question on Twitter and social media very, very often, and it's a very fair question, and especially given that we've had decades leading up to this of you know, the NCAA being able to establish its rules, being able to enforce its rules, being able to have a lot of freedom and flexibility when it comes to these rules. And you also see it with other organizations as well. You see, you know, I just saw, you know, conversation on Twitter where it's like, well, why can't we do what FIFA has been doing for decades and have transfer penalties and have transfer fees? Well, the answer to that is kind of a similar one, because I think what a lot of people don't know is that the European Court of Justice actually ruled in the DR decision a couple years ago that FIFA's transfer fee rules are also illegal. But similar kind of issues to the NCAA. But the answer, and the answer is kind of in kind of a curious thing, where the NCAA has done a lot to position itself as being different than professional sports, as being, an educational opportunity, kind of the path to getting a scholarship. And it's done a lot of good work doing that. It's really kind of made itself and really used this in legal arguments as well, and saying we are a unique product. We are a unique labor market. We are a unique thing. But the flip side of that is that it's a lot easier to say we are also a monospony, which is kind of the labor side equivalent of a monopoly, where, yes, there are competitor leagues like NJCAA and the NCCAA, Christian, the NIAA, of course. I always have trouble with these acronyms, but they're so much smaller. They control so much less of the market share. And especially when we're talking about high-level college basketball, where you have kind of this dual opportunity, as the NCAA sells it, this dual opportunity to not only play at kind of the highest levels and showcase yourself to, especially for football and basketball and really all the sports, to showcase yourself to the pros. The NCAA is it. NCAA Division I is it. They control the market in that area. So you're able to say this is a monopoly environment. This is all of these, all these teams coming together, and creating these rules, contract combination or conspiracy under Section 1 of the Sherman Act, and therefore keeping athletes out of this market is a violation of antitrust law, where these rules that, yes, they are playing rules, they're eligibility rules. And for a long time, courts saw this as, well, they're just eligibility rules. They're true eligibility rules. Now, and especially now that we have, these rules coming at the cost of millions of dollars for some players, where players, not being allowed to this extra year of eligibility is costing them a significant amount of money, that's when these rules become illegal. That's when these rules become problematic. And yeah, we have similar situations with, like, taking the bar. That costs lawyers millions of dollars if they don't pass the bar, or if they for some reason don't get approved to practice. But that's sanctioned by the Supreme Courts of the states. The licensing board for your wife, I don't know the exact situation, but a lot of these licensing boards are sanctioned by the states, or they have competitors where if you don't meet the standards for this licensing board, you can go to a different one. It's not keeping you out of the market, or it's just not a situation where they control enough of the market.
I have so many questions based off everything you said. But first, I've never even heard the word monospony before. That's a new word for me, not going to lie. But like, playing college sports isn't necessarily a right. So like, if you have the athletic ability, because they can make millions of dollars outside of the NCAA. Like, if you are good enough to play in the G League, like, that's exposure to the NBA. Like, that's an option for you. Like, I go back to the golf example. Like, you don't have to go to college to play in the PGA Tour. There's still more to explain.
And that's potentially the next frontier. Like, I think we're starting to see, and Darren Heitner, he's a sports, college sports attorney. He's very vocal in this space. He has, thought quite a bit that, allowing James Nandi in, he kind of takes this kind of 3D chess kind of approach, or kind of thinks about it and says, well, maybe this is the NCAA trying to position themselves as being a competitor to the G League, which sounds counterintuitive when you think about, like, we want to be able to control the market. Like, from a business perspective, we want to do that. But also, if you have basketball players, filing these eligibility lawsuits, you can say, well, there are competitors here. We don't control the entire market. You can go to the G League. Maybe there's some truth to that, but it's not the case in football. We don't really have the equivalent in football. I mean, maybe the USL, but it's not the same thing. And also, again, the NCAA has just positioned itself as being, it's not the same as the pros. It's this different environment. It's this unique environment, and one where you can get a degree as part of the thing. And I will say, with the golf example, golf is quite a bit different, because golf is a single entity. It's one organization, and they don't control enough of the market to be considered a monopoly under Section 2, and they don't have that contract combination or conspiracy that kind of implicates them under Section 1, where if you have multiple parties who are agreeing to these restrictive rules together, that's a lot different than one kind of organization coming in and saying, these are the rules.
Is it the NCAA's fault that there's not an alternative for football?
It's not. It's not, but that's the reality that they live in. That's kind of what they've kind of, well, you know, I won't say that it's what they've created, but it's what they've been able to do. I mean, it's not their fault in kind of from the perspective of, you know, there just hasn't been any competitors who have been strong enough to kind of get there, but it's also just, again, the reality that they live in. It's the market that they have. And, you know, when we're talking about Section 1, it's not like an intent requirement, like monopoly power for Section 2. There is some measure of intent. There's some measure of kind of, you're actually using this monopoly power that's required. Section 1 is not necessarily the case. If you have these restrictive covenants, if you have these contract combinations and conspiracies that unreasonably restrain trade in an economic market, which this is very much an economic labor market now, that's where antitrust problems become really evident.
That's kind of my question. Like, if it's being looked at as a monopoly, is that taken into consideration when you're looking at the NCAA? Like, because there's not an option, like there's not another option. So when you're evaluating the landscape, is that being held against the NCAA, even though it's not its fault? That's basically what you're saying?
Well, it's kind of the same thing when you see mergers. I mean, when you see, like, obviously it fell through, but here in Boise, the Albertsons and Kroger merger was a big deal, and wasn't necessarily their fault that there weren't, a lot of competitors there, but it still fell through because because all these different states and the FTC started looking at it and saying, hey, maybe you're going to be controlling too much of the market. Maybe this is a problem. Maybe this is a big deal. And yes, grocery stores, there's much lower barrier to entry than, starting college sports leagues, but still it was a big issue. And in fact, that's why you see, and this came up in the Kroger and Albertsons deal as well. It comes up in these mergers all the time, divestment, where it's like, we're going to create competitors for ourselves, where I'm not suggesting that the NCAA should do this or that they even will do this, but maybe they can create competitors for themselves. But that's well, maybe that gets into the long rumored Power 2 breakaway, where now you have the Power 2 competing against the rest of college Division I college sports. But is that even actually competition? Is that still even the same market? I mean, that's where all these things get really complicated.
So sorry, I want to make sure a couple more things on the component about conspiring and multiple entities. Who in this equation is seen as the multiple entities?
The different schools.
Okay.
So you have 120 plus schools that are all coming together as part of Division I NCAA. And, it's tempting to think about it as like, okay, well, it's one entity. It's the NCAA. It's Division I NCAA. But the NCAA is, at its root, a conglomerate of all these different schools. And the different schools vote and they come together and they create, again, these contracts, combinations, and conspiracies. And conspiracy is a nasty word, but it really just means like contracts and combinations. It really just means you're coming together to create these restrictive covenants that impact this labor market. And yeah, it is the schools. And it's the same thing. And you look at it like you look at the NFL, for example. The NFL is not one entity. I mean, they like to think they are. They have made that legal argument. It went to the Supreme Court in 2010 in American Needle. But the Supreme Court said, no, you're not really one entity for the purpose of antitrust law. You're actually 32 different entities that come together and create this kind of essentially a trade association.
So one other element about, is the fact that schools clearly want to employ, hire, whatever, bring on this athlete they want to roster a specific athlete. Is that the justification enough to say that an eligibility rule is going to restrict that? Like if Nate Oats wants Charles Bediako on his roster, is that fact alone enough to say, that we've got to review this and we've got to see is it just the eligibility thing that's keeping that from happening? And is that justifiable? Like, because I look at, we talk about, the different pro leagues, and obviously there's the collective bargaining element to that. So I'm curious where like that line is drawn versus other things where the pro leagues, there's, if you're going to sign a vet, their salary's gonna be pretty high just based on their experience, their tenure, how long they've been there. There's reasons to have rookies on your team because of the salary cap hit that they take because they have a smaller salary. That's all been collectively bargained. Is that why it's acceptable, or does that sort of system create this opportunity where it's like it's going to be harder for a team to look at a 15-year vet and say, yeah, I want him on my roster because he's going to cost us more, but it's enforceable because it's been collectively bargained, or it's enforceable because there's really no argument that now, nobody really wants him. So like it's okay.
It's enforceable because it's collectively bargained. That's a big part of it. And there are a lot of different nuances to that. Like, for example, it's not enough to simply say, well, someone wants him. So, Nate Oats wants Charles Bediako. So therefore it's an unreasonable restriction on this labor market. There's a lot more that kind of goes into it to determine, because the Sherman Act only bars unreasonable restrictions of trade. And whether or not eligibility rules are unreasonable is still a matter of debate. We've had 70 plus lawsuits over eligibility over the past year or so, but we've also had a lot of them go very, very differently just in terms of the way that these judges are handling it, and whether they feel like it's unreasonable, whether they feel like it's even subject to the Sherman Act in the first place. I mean, there's some judges who are going back to, pre-Alston precedent and saying these are not commercial restrictions. These are just true eligibility rules. Kind of similar to what you're just saying, Joe, again, these aren't really economic decisions, but for the pros, it has been long established that these restrictions are absolutely antitrust questions. You go back to age rules, for example, in the NFL, where we think about the fact that the NFL, they require you to be 3 years out of high school to be able to play in the NFL, to be able to be drafted, and we think about that as set in stone. And we think about it set in stone in large part because of the Claret decision back in 2004, where the Second Circuit ruled, well, it's part of the collective bargaining agreement, therefore it's valid. But what people forget about the Claret decision, or don't know about the Claret decision, is that Claret actually won at the district court. He actually got an injunction that forced the NFL to enter him into the NFL draft. The NFL very quickly appealed. The Second Circuit very quickly reversed. But there was a period of more than a few weeks where Maurice Claret was eligible as a true sophomore, just finishing his true sophomore year, which is 2 years out of high school, to play in the NFL. And it's the exact same reasons why we're seeing kind of the breakdown of eligibility rules now, where this was a rule that was come together by the 32 teams that restricts an athlete's ability to enter a very lucrative economic market.
Talking a lot of high level stuff. I'm going to try to dumb it down to the real basics. So when we're talking eligibility, back in my day, which was only a couple years ago, but seems like decades ago, the common belief was once you graduate high school and you become eligible for NCAA sports, you essentially had 6 years to play 4 seasons, whether that's a gray shirt followed by a red shirt. That was the base level. And obviously there's more nuance to it. There were things that you could do to extend that. One of them, religious exemptions. When we talk about BYU, the running joke was you're going to go play a bunch of grown adults that have families at home because of the religious exemption. Outside of the religious exemption, how were certain NCAA athletes able to play longer than that 4 years in the past?
Yeah, so medical hardships, right? So some of the hardship waivers we talk about, medical or family situations, there weren't a ton of big broad umbrellas that they could fit under, but does it qualify for a hardship? Medical is going to be the one that you see most common. There could be instances where you were mistreated, where potentially somebody would rule in your favor on that. But yeah, for the most part, it was a 5-year clock where you could play 4 seasons of competition, and those seasons of competition were defined a little bit differently for every sport as far as the number of competitions that you could play before you lost your ability to redshirt, and medical redshirts come into effect there as well, where some of them don't necessarily require the same level of appeal if you meet some of these standards. But the hardship component really is medical, mistreatment, extenuating family circumstances, just some of those kind of basic things. But the crux of the issue is that it was always one party who was deciding. And I know Sam has talked about that before, and we'll talk about it again, that the NCAA was the body that decided the rule, the body that decided what the hardships were, and the body that decided if your hardship qualified for a waiver. And I think that's what, has really been drawn into question.
So you have the NCAA acting as judge, jury, and executioner for a long time. Why did that change? Why is that no longer the case, Sam?
Because of Diego Pavia. Diego Pavia, of course, the now ex-Vanderbilt quarterback, though I guess that maybe somewhat, he's definitely ex-Vanderbilt quarterback at this point.
Gotta be.
He corrected me on Twitter about that, actually, so I know that for sure. Not really a correction, but he's during the appeal of his case, his lawyer said something kind of curious about if you rule that our case is moot, we're just going to be back in front of the district court seeking another injunction. I'm like, I mean, he's going to be looking for another year of eligibility, and people ran with it, and he responded like, nope, I'm definitely not. This is all cap, as he said. I'm like, okay, well. And then we found out a few weeks later that he's adding more plaintiffs to the lawsuit, and that's why they're looking for another injunction. But whatever, that's a whole tangent. But yeah, it's all about Diego Pavia. It's all because kind of in the backlash, or not really the backlash, but the ripple effects of the state of Ohio transfer portal decision that we've talked about, and the Tennessee decision that allowed for, or that really kind of barred the NCAA from enforcing the rules regarding pre-enrollment NIL negotiation. The ripple effects of that were essentially Diego Pavia and Ryan Doughton, his attorney, saying maybe we can get another year out of this, because we're in a situation where Pavia had played 2 years at junior college at New Mexico Military Academy, then played 2 years at New Mexico State, which is a Division I school, and then 1 year at Vanderbilt, and including a redshirt year in there as well. And you look at the kind of those, or a COVID year, never had a redshirt year, which became a thing. But you look at those years, and it's kind of like, kind of that one of these things is not like the other type of things, where you look at the junior college years and you compare that to playing in the SEC, and you're like, this is a completely different ballgame. This is a completely different thing. And we can make the argument based on what we just talked about that the NCAA already has all these exceptions for, not counting certain years towards your 5-year clock. Why are we counting junior college the same as a Division I year, as a year in the SEC? Why does that make sense? How does that make sense? And that's primarily what he based his argument on. He also talked about, there is competition between, kind of ironically and kind of, considering what we were just talking about, it was kind of an ironic argument that was accepted. There's competition between the NCAA and the NJCAA, and the NCAA is essentially favoring itself by allowing athletes to play, 5 years in, 5 years in the NCAA. But if they play in any other league, it takes away from that clock. So you're incentivized to only play in our league. Was able to make that argument. That argument was accepted, and Judge Campbell of Middle District Tennessee said, "Yeah, no, this makes sense. We're going to grant an injunction. We're going to give you the ability to play next year." And that was that. And from there, the world kind of went crazy a little bit, because you instantly had people like Darren Heitner, on Twitter saying, well, clearly now that this is open, the NCAA is going to have to make it available for everyone. You had athletes popping into, if they were coming to my DMs, and a lot of athletes have contacted me saying, how can I get my extra year? I'm sure people who actually have power in this space are getting a lot more DMs than I was. But yeah, you just had so much confusion. You had so much kind of like, well, does this Pavia thing apply to me as well? And that led to more lawsuits. It led to the NCAA trying to kind of cut off this litigation by issuing the Pavia waiver, which, oh my goodness, that backfired so spectacularly if you look back on it. Because the Pavia waiver was, we're going to take everyone who's in Diego Pavia's situation, which is to say, they played in a non-NCAA league prior to entering the NCAA. We're going to give them an extra year while we appeal the Pavia decision and try to see this play out. But it backfired in a big way, because one, it led to a lot of confusion where players like Jed Elad and Nizar Fakurian and Jamori Robinson and Cortez Bram and Tau Martinson, they all said, well, we should be able to get this as well, even though our 5-year clock expired, and the NCAA didn't really make that clear. There's testimony from Greg Schiano in the Jed Elad case that said, we thought Jed Elad was good, but he had played a redshirt year. Diego Pavia hadn't played a redshirt year. And apparently, as they learned in March, after Jed Elad was already on campus, the Pavia waiver only applied to players who had not exhausted their 5-year clocks, that only had, one of their 4 seasons in junior college, but were still within their 5-year clock. So if they redshirted, they didn't get that extra year, but they didn't know that. So that led to more lawsuits. The guys I just mentioned won their lawsuits, would led to even more confusion and more lawsuits. And it just kind of spiraled from there, and players just kept pushing the boundaries, where you saw wins based on, junior college. All of a sudden it's like, okay, well, NCAA, that should count. That shouldn't count as well. Division II, that shouldn't count as well. Then of course leading to pro players as well. So just a huge spiral effect, and a huge just like continually pushing the boundaries for over the course of a year plus.
I mean, this one's a new challenge, and I understand that. But some of the other waivers we've seen, like the ones Mike was talking about, in college basketball, that seemed to just be exploiting a loophole. And somebody finally exploited it. I know the Pavia situation is a new challenge, but would there be any benefit? And I think I know the answer to this question, but I want to ask it anyway. Would there be any benefit? Because the rules were written for previous iterations of college athletics.
Yeah.
These are not modernized eligibility rules. Is there any benefit to the NCAA scrapping their eligibility rules, re-establishing what it means to be a collegiate athlete, and these are the eligibility requirements across the board? Is that just going to get challenged again, or does it need to be collectively bargained? What's the way out of where we're at right now?
See, it's funny because you asked a different question than what you could have asked, because you asked, is that going to get challenged again? And the answer is yes, of course. But like I said before, the Sherman Act only restricts unreasonable restraints of trade. I am of the belief, and I could be wrong on this because we don't know anything right now. I'm sitting here as a legal expert on in this space, and someone who's currently writing a law review article on eligibility rules, and I can't tell you whether this is actually going to be the case or not, because judges have just been so incredibly inconsistent about this, and they're also unsure what the rules are. I feel, but a lot of them have been crying out and saying, just do it based on academics. Just do it based on your academic status, because there's still a distinguishing product here. And this goes to language in the Elson decision, where, yes, the NCAA lost 9-0, but there's language in that decision that basically says, at least in some part, there is a unique product here. There's a unique product that's worth preserving here that is, kind of this college sports, this that is distinguished from professional sports, and doing it where it's like, well, you can get, you have 5 years to complete your undergraduate degree, and you can get a master's degree on top of that for 1 year or something like that. I'm just spitballing out there. That might be more defensible, and I'm throwing in the might there, but that might be more defensible than saying you get a certain amount of years, because when you're talking about a certain amount of years, well, there are reasons, like I'm speaking as a professor here, there are sometimes reasons why students need to take more than 4 years or 5 years to complete a degree. There are things that happen. There are all these hardships that can happen, and the NCAA has tried to do that with their hardship waivers, but Mike, you really kind of talked a lot about this. There's so much inconsistency with the way the NCAA operates, and that is where that has left plaintiffs and judges the opportunity to pick holes at it and kind of tear at those holes quite a bit, because the NCAA left those holes there. And if they cleaned it up, and this goes to the original Furkurian decision where Judge Connolly of the Western District of Wisconsin, the reason why he gave Furkurian the injunction, and it was eventually overturned, but I think his language was spot on. The NCAA needs to have meaningful exceptions. It's not just exceptions that are sometimes applied, are not that are kind of inconsistent even in the kind of the policy lens. They need to have meaningful exceptions that they actually do enough to non-arbitrarily enforce.
So non-arbitrarily enforced, like you've talked about this quite a bit. If the NCAA established a third-party review and they're going to establish their consistency, and does that give, I mean, it takes some of the ire away from the NCAA because they're not the ones making the decision, but does it give people less of a leg to stand on in challenging this legally if they were to establish a third-party review opportunity?
Potentially. It would really depend on how it's set up. It would really depend on how meaningful it actually is. If it's something that's created through, we come back to this a lot, but if it's something that's created through a collectively bargained environment, then absolutely. If it's something where, both a hypothetical union and the league have the opportunity to come together to choose the arbitrators for this, then absolutely. If it's something where it's just going to be the NCAA, but with a different cloak, like let's face it, the College Sports Commission is in a lot of ways the NCAA, just with a different cloak. I guess it's a little different because it's only controlled by the Power Four instead of having the rest of it involved. But
once again, we come back to collective bargaining.
We do.
Okay.
We do.
Eligibility. Initially viewed as being about fairness for all these member institutions. Now looking at it as limiting earning potential for student athletes. So which is it and what should it be?
We've talked a lot before about the economic realities of college sports changing rapidly. And I think that is really at the heart of this conversation as well, is that, I think for a long time, the eligibility rules were in place to promote fairness in terms of competition and in terms of, just an expectation, even for the consumer. Like, well, everybody knows what this is now. You know what college sports is. And you talked about it with, BYU and some of the other schools that were more apt to have players who had a religious exemption. That was always kind of a source of confusion, for a long time. It's like, how is he 27? Like, how is he still in college? And it did promote confusion. And I think that we've entered a stage where no one even knows anymore. And so I think, fairness in competition, fairness to the consumer, fairness to the people building rosters, and also fairness to the next generation who is always coming through with an opportunity. Because as we talked about before, even now in the economic reality where there's a ton of money at play for some, there is not a ton of money at play for most. And the benefit of coming and playing college sports and getting that opportunity is less economically driven. And there's still great benefits to be derived from that. And so the opportunity for high school athletes to, mature into that, for middle school and younger athletes to aspire to that, there is a lot of kind of fairness. The fairness goes out the window in the way that it's been adjudicated, like you've brought up. And so, there's a ton of reasons to have eligibility standards. We're just in an entirely new market where we have to say what's fair and what's fair to who. It didn't used to be as big of a concern that the rules were fair to the athletes that were in the system because there wasn't enough economic harm to them to really be concerned about it. What did I miss?
Not much. Nothing. Honestly, I think you hit the nail on the head because this is now a economic right. Like you could say there's no right to play college sports, and I think a lot of courts would agree with you. But under antitrust law, there are economic rights to being allowed into labor markets, and to not have those labor markets institute, through contracts, combinations, and conspiracies that unreasonably restrain trade, that institute unreasonable barriers to entry into those labor markets. And I look at, this is a lawsuit that was just filed last week. A case involving a defensive lineman at Cal, and he suffered. He redshirted for a year in 2021 when he was at Notre Dame, and he then during spring ball in spring of 2022 he tore his ACL, and he was out for the year, or at least he thought he was out for the year until in late November in a 44-0 game against Boston College, his coaches said, "Why don't you go out there for a few plays?" And then a few years later, the NCAA said, "Well, you were out there for a few plays during 2022. Clearly, you were that can't be a medical hardship year." And just a few garbage time plays. And this gets to the whole inconsistency, and it gets to the whole, like, you just had the, another case, this one was decided last week, involving a Purdue offensive lineman. The judge, even while ruling in favor of the NCAA, even while saying, we're bound by this new Foucaultian precedent that requires, and by the way, did not rule in favor of the NCAA in terms of, like, the eligibility rules are legal, but in terms of they just didn't give enough evidence to show us that they're legal at this stage. The judge spent some time, there's about a page at the end of it, a page concluding paragraph saying it's really understandable why these eligibility lawsuits are happening, because nobody really has the answers anymore. And it's not just courts, tearing holes in this fabric. It's also the NCAA tearing holes in this fabric, because they're allowing through the institution of these exemptions, guys like James Nandi and guys like Monte Harrison at Arkansas, who, played professional baseball, played in major leagues, and is now able to be a 30-year-old freshman at Arkansas. And the NCAA on its own is creating a lot of these holes here. And that is what is really kind of implicating a lot of these economic rights and making it a lot more justifiable for these athletes to kind of throw their hands up in the air and say, well, he's getting it, why can't I as well?
To Mike's point, I'm curious your perspective. When we talk about all this stuff, it benefits these individual student athletes. It behooves them to stick around and have more eligibility. As far as eligibility limits are concerned, who benefits the most? Is it the next generation of student athletes that may lose out on opportunities if we're keeping people longer? Is it the member institutions? Where does the benefit lie in maintaining some sort of limit to eligibility?
So the NCAA has argued extensively in these cases that eligibility rules are there to protect the next generation. And I think there's a lot of value in that. I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think there are ways that the NCAA, itself kind of contradicts that, which is definitely a sore spot for judges and plaintiffs in these cases. And yeah, I'm not discounting that at all. And it is huge for the next generation, because, like, if you look at the NFL, for example, I mean, imagine if the NFL had kind of the similar things where you had to kind of cycle out, cycle out players, players would graduate and more players would get opportunities to play in the NFL. Like, rosters are small. You don't get the opportunity, oftentimes not because you're not good enough, but because there just aren't enough roster spots. And the same would absolutely be true in college sports if you had, 20-year clocks like you do in the NFL. But also go back to something Mike said before, where, when he was talking about the NFL, it's like, well, there's a lot of value to teams having rookies instead of veterans, because veterans are more expensive. And that is an argument that's being made in these antitrust eligibility cases as well, where it's like, actually it's really beneficial to the schools to continually cycle out players, because, a guy who's been playing for a few years and has established himself and this major star and is able to go on the transfer market and transfer portal market and say, I did really well at this school, Duke, for basketball, for example, Duke, North Carolina, Alabama, all these different, high value schools make me an offer. Mm-hmm. Like, that is an incredibly competitive environment. And it's the reason why, these numbers that you hear in college sports about, in football, $40 million rosters, you look at, which ones are $40 million, and a lot of it's transfer portal. A lot of it's guys, a lot of it's teams that are picking up guys out of the transfer portal. So also a lot of value to teams themselves to cycle out players and have freshmen, because freshmen are, generally speaking, a whole lot cheaper.
I think eligibility rules keep college sports non-professional. Like the example you were talking about with, flipping the NFL versus, college. If there was only 5 years of eligibility in the NFL, it's like, that's to me what keeps college sports non-professional. You know what you're getting in junior high, you know what you're getting in high school, you know what you're getting in college, and then you become a professional and you can play as long as a team thinks you have value to keep you on the roster.
Yeah, that's true.
I want to dive into what you brought up about the academic component, and that might be justifiable. And I understand the caveat that we don't know for sure, but it might be.
Light is carrying a lot of water there.
But I'm curious to explore a little of how it could actually be structured and what blurs the line of what's defensible, what doesn't blur the line, like kind of what approaches it. As you were talking, where my brain was going was, can schools decide, or can it be decided at the NCAA level among the schools that, now that we're talking about the economic value of this, we've had the scholarships before, obviously, and now there's direct payments from schools to athletes. Can it be set up to where, a university is only going to pay someone for being on their roster, whether that be through a scholarship or through direct payments, for 6 years or whatever? Like, you can only receive benefits from these institutions in exchange for playing sports for 6 academic years or whatever. And it's like, that's the clock toward your, earning your degree. That's why we're doing it. We're paying you for the opportunity, but like, it's not that it's the payment first, right? It's academic first. We understand there is an economic component to this. There's a lot of value. We're going to pay you for your time and your effort and your energy and everything you bring to us. But, we as a group have decided that, like, we're only going to pay athletes for them doing this for us for 6 years because, and that could be if you're, 4 years at Oregon and 2 years at Oregon State. It's like, well, Fresno State can't pay you for the 7th year because you've already taken benefits from a group, an institution in this group for 6 years. That sounds like conspiring. So I don't know where the line gets drawn on what's okay about an academic component versus the economic component.
Well, those are two different questions. And I'll say, like, for what you're saying, the key words in your sentence were, we as a group decided, because that's where the contract combination or conspiracy comes in. But the Sherman Act, and I've said this a few times, the Sherman Act only restricts unreasonable restraints of trade. The way, and this goes a little bit into the weeds, but the way that's kind of looked at is we look at the rule of reason. It's a 3-step process, but the crux of it, the very bare bones part of it is, we're going to balance the anti-competitive effects, which is the restrictions that are being placed, like the harm that's happening to the person trying to enter into and compete in this labor market, versus the pro-competitive benefits. And a lot of courts have accepted, keeping college sports as college sports to be a pro-competitive benefit. The question is whether that pro-competitive benefit outweighs the anti-competitive harm. And certainly, if you're taking pieces out of that Jenga puzzle and making that pro-competitive harm, or that pro-competitive benefit significantly weaker by saying, well, we're also going to allow, players who have, already, completed, 1 degree and plus another master's degree, and we're going to continue to allow them to play, even though they're just playing at kind of this, or even though they're just, taking this, kind of useless online master's program, where, they're, why they're really there.
Yeah.
Like, that pulls pieces out of that makes that pro-competitive benefit significantly less defensible. But if you do more to kind of strengthen that pro-competitive benefit, you actually kind of bulwark it to make the academics so much more impactful. That's where we get into that might be defensible. That's where courts have said, in some of these cases, that might be defensible. So it's more about that than it is about, if you have this limit, regardless of what the limit is, regardless of where the limit is, that is anti-competitive harm right there. Mm-hmm. Like, you can argue, you could say that, a 20-year clock and having a 20-year limit here is anti-competitive harm, because it is. It literally is. That doesn't mean it's unreasonable, though, when you talk about balancing the anti-competitive harms versus the pro-competitive benefits.
So I'm probably not using the right language here, but I'm curious, is it possible for the college sports enterprise to position itself and to take steps to where, even though it is a labor market and it does have these economic realities, that is not what it is first and foremost? Can they take steps to where they make decisions that allow, right now it's like win at all costs. And winning at all costs means building the right roster and paying the right amount of money and doing these sorts of things. If that is no longer, from an institutional standpoint, the driving force, and it's like, we acknowledge that there's an economic component to this, and we acknowledge that winning is awesome. But we also acknowledge that us being a college sports industry is the most important thing. And so the most important thing to us is that people can age out, you get your degree, the next person gets to get their degree. And so can it be both?
I don't know how.
Yeah, okay.
At this point, I just don't know how you practically do that in a way that you're actually able to convince the judge that you've actually done it, where it's not like, just putting a coat of paint over the same thing. That might be a thing where if we do have the power 2 or power for breakaway, and we have this new lower division, they're able to say we're more like the NCAA back in back in the early 80s and
Miles
70s
Brand
and
era.
What's that?
Miles Brand era.
Yeah, we're more like that than we are, like them. Maybe that's able to do it. Like there, and I think it's the same for employment. Like I think there is a line here of, in terms of sports, in terms of where you are kind of on the spectrum of, the spectrum between, name a really small liberal arts college in Division III and Alabama. There's a line on that spectrum where it's no longer kind of this quasi-professional sports league, which is what the top level of college sports is right now. Like you say, well, it's the difference between college sports and professional sports. At the top level, there's no difference right now because the players are getting paid and there's sponsorships everywhere and it's just money. But yeah, I just don't know how you put the toothpaste in the tube. There are ways to make eligibility rules enforceable. Collective bargaining is one. There's an argument. What's that?
There it is.
Yeah,
That's the answer.
Collective bargaining is one. Is that a reasonable, feasible solution? That is a very fair question. And I'm not going to pretend. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I've been very vocal in the opposite direction. There's a lot of barriers to collective bargaining, both legally and practically. But there's also an argument, and this was bolstered somewhat by maybe some language in Alston, a lot of people have taken and run with it. I'm not terribly convinced, but the Choi v. Brown University case will give us a lot of clues here. Maybe the SEC has their own eligibility rules, and the Big Ten has their own eligibility rules, and they compete with each other. So we don't have that monopoly problem.
I'm gonna have to look that up after the show.
There's another word you said that I've never heard before either. So
it's actually real simple. It's just monopoly on the labor side. Yeah.
When you say it like that, it makes me feel real dumb, Sam. I appreciate that.
But yeah, and like there's been a lot of argument. There's been a lot of debate about like if these individual conferences were to have their own eligibility rules, like that might be defensible under antitrust law because we have this competition here. And then and the third solution would be finding that line on the balance between the anti-competitive harms and pro-competitive justifications. But boy, is that hard to do when judges are all over the place, because you might have one judge say, "Oh yeah, no, this is exactly where the line should be," and another judge say, "No, actually, I don't see it that way."
it's whatever benefits their local institution the most, right?
I think that's a little overblown, but
Is it though?
Me and several thousand people watching this was one of the more surreal moments of my entire life. Watching the judge on YouTube with a bunch of Ole Miss fans and other college sports fans, watching the judge render the Chambliss decision, unbelievably surreal. There might have been some
favoritism,
a little bit of favoritism there, maybe, but I don't know. I think a lot of that's overblown.
All right. Well, we're already pushing our time limit here on the show, so we're going to wrap it up with our unilateral decision of the day. Eligibility. Is that the right of the athlete, or is that the right of the system, and why?
So it is. I straddle the fence only slightly on this. It is first and foremost a right for the athlete. We've entered that reality because of the economics, and we've talked about that. I still believe firmly that college sports, we want to say it's a free market. We want to say that, like, well, just let the market decide. I still really believe that that's not quite the truth. I believe that because the system is so propped by subsidies, both public and, federal and state, and also so much of the donor-led giving is tax advantaged, that it is so massively subsidized that I don't think it truly is a free market yet. I think that if you were having to make decisions based solely on what's our broadcast revenue, what's our ticket revenue, what's our corporate sponsor revenue, I think that a lot of these things would be different. And, you could have this free market conversation and allow the athletes to make whatever they're worth making, because there'd be a pretty definitive line of what are they worth. Right now, you can just go out and ask for more money. We've talked about it. Like, there's the $20.5 million cap, which is irrelevant at this point, and everybody's pushing back on it, saying we don't want it.
Because they can go, cap?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. There's a suggestion. Because somebody can just go ask for more money, and somebody can give that money in exchange for subsidized benefits, and benefits not only in their taxes, but also like the things that they get to do, the access that they get, which is subsidized. Like, these are, state owned facilities to a lot of degree. And like, there's just so much behind that I have a hard time being like, yeah, that's a real business, and they're making real decisions about how much those players are worth. And so you have to find a way in that system, in that public system that is subsidized, that has these different advantages that most of the private sector doesn't. There has to be guardrails around it. There has to be ways, because otherwise that system doesn't, like, it falls apart. So yes, and I'm glazing over the fact that I do believe that it is an athlete right first, because I do believe that. But at the end of the day, there's got to be a way that these schools are given some guidance on how they can operate. And it's not just the schools, it's the state houses, it's everything else that goes into it, that people have a vested interest in the success of the university, and they have all these levers they can pull that just make it not quite a free market. And so it's a little bit of both.
You left out one of the stakeholders there, and one that really has a very strong vested interest in seeing kind of clarity on these eligibility rules. That's the athletes themselves.
Sure.
Because at the end of the day, like, the athletes want to know how much time they have. They want to know whether they do get that extra year. And right now there's just a lot of very justifiable confusion about that. And to answer your question, Dom, and for, kind of my unilateral decision, it used to be the right of the NCAA to define its product. It used to be. That has completely left the building, where they've let it get away from them. The schools have pushed it away from them, however you want to make the case, but it's no longer kind of the right of the NCAA to define its product anymore. Right now, those conversations are being had in courtrooms, and to whatever extent this matters in the halls of Congress. And so, as we talked about last week, but the fact of the matter is, now that we have, and regardless of whether or not it's a free market, a truly free market, I don't think that's necessarily material to this conversation. I think it's the type of thing where it's like, because they're getting paid, regardless of how they're getting paid, because these athletes are getting paid, they have an economic right under antitrust law to be able to fairly compete in this market, to not have unreasonable restraints placed on them. And that's where the crux is right now, and that's where the rub is right now. And trying to figure out what is reasonable is going to be an enduring challenge over the next several years, provided we don't get federal legislation, which fair assumption.
Joe,
collective bargaining. That solves everything.
It does, though. I will say again, it's one of those, like, you guys know that meme from South Park from the Underpants Gnomes episode, where it's like, step one, collect underpants. Step two, question mark. Step three, profit. There's still a lot of that when it comes to collective bargaining.
Well, but what's the alternative? The alternative is to continue to litigate this at every step of the way, or to have Congress intervene and establish rules for you. And
so it's really, continue to litigate this.
Yeah.
Or collectively bargain.
Yeah.
Every time we talk about something, like, what could solve this? Collective bargaining is one of the answers.
For the record, I do not disagree.
Let's figure that out.
You look at the NFL. I mean, I go back to the Claret decision I mentioned earlier, and it is such an important precedent for exactly what college sports is facing right now. You go back to Major League Baseball in the 70s, where you had the Messersmith and McNally arbitration decision that threatened to tear a hole in all of Major League Baseball, because all of a sudden the reserve clause is dead and players are Boy, this sounds familiar. Players are free agents every single year. I wonder where else that happens. Mm-hmm. And the answer was collective bargaining. It just, the question of how to get there is definitely an enduring question.
Let's start investing our time there.
Yeah.
Well, today it's lawsuits. Tomorrow it'll be more lawsuits. By the time we have our next show, who knows how many tens of hundreds of eligibility cases will be talked about. But either way, that does it for this episode of Unilateral Decisions. We'll see you next time.